Over the years, since my experience with the START service, I've had a different view of tragedy and trauma. It's never surprising, I believe, that people are in trouble after suffering major tragedy or trauma. It's obviously understandable. But what I find really amazing about human beings is how resilient they can be, what people can endure and overcome. Instead of being pessimistic and only hoping for relatively modest improvements, which I think is a norm in this area, I try to encourage people to aim high because I know others have done it and I know that it's possible to succeed despite the most horrific experiences. I've also observed over the years that people can learn resilience. It's not just a capacity that's inborn in some and lacking in others. In psychiatry and psychology, we can measure resilience, or at least its counterpart, vulnerability, and it's generally regarded as a dimensional quality or a spectrum, somewhere along which all of us can be located. No doubt we all have our genetic endowment, which plays a large role, but equally other factors can also have a large effect on resilience. Clinically, my impression is that resilient people, by which I mean people who have greater than average resilience, are generally optimistic. They look on adversity or setbacks as a challenge to be faced and overcome. They use positive thinking and active coping strategies. These are all things that can be taught and learned. The greatest enemies, I believe, in people coping positively with adversity is demoralisation and what we call learned helplessness. Demoralisation is when a person has given up, when they feel defeated and have lost all hope. Learned helplessness occurs when someone falsely believes that nothing they do can make a positive difference, usually because of repeated experiences of failure. These things again are learned and can be unlearned, or rather, other things can be learned in their place, like positive thinking and optimism. I know this because I've seen people do it. In medicine, we learn most of what we know from experience, and I've been describing some of my experience to you. But the other great source of knowledge in medicine is research. So what does research tell us about resilience? It's relatively recent, only beginning in the 1960s and 70s. Generally, the research on resilience deals with a rather different population than the one I've been talking about. They tend to focus on groups or large numbers of people exposed to adverse circumstances or lower intensity sort of trauma, while I've been talking about individuals who've been exposed to very severe, extreme levels of trauma. Reassuringly, though, the research tells us much the same thing from groups as we learn from individuals in clinical practice. Much of the formal research is focused on children, especially high-risk children recovering from traumatic experience or overcoming disadvantage to succeed. They mean high risk with developmental problems. The lessons from this research on children is clear. Choose your parents wisely and make sure that they look after you well, for then you will do well. Look at Colin Powell, the son of Jamaican immigrant parents who grew up in the South Bronx and who rose to become a 4-star general and Secretary of State of the United States. Another large body of research in this area concerns disasters. People exposed to natural disasters, terrorist attacks, things like that in particular. We know from this that virtually everybody who's exposed will show immediately afterwards signs and symptoms of an acute stress reaction, what the press and emergency services tend to call shock. This subsides fairly quickly, so that by about 4 weeks, 90% of people will have returned pretty much to their baseline. In fact, most of them return to baseline within a few days. But about 10% will continue to show ongoing problems, what's become known as post-traumatic stress disorder. And these people have generally had psychological problems before the event. Research shows that the outcome of trauma on people does not depend on the nature of the trauma, but rather on the characteristics of the individual. With the exception that man-made disasters like terrorist attacks or serious assaults and so on tend to have on average a greater effect than natural disasters like floods, fires, earthquakes, and so forth. Research tells us that characteristics like being able to see that setbacks are due to specific things that are temporary, rather than due to your own failings, and that it's normal to win some and lose some rather than always expecting to win, are associated with greater resilience. Resilient people learn from failure rather than feeling defeated by it. These characteristics can be learned by those who do not already have them, and this can increase their resilience. Overall, the research on groups essentially agrees with what I and many others have observed in individuals, and that is that resilience is a set of skills that some have and others can learn. Much of this seems to revolve around how the person perceives the adversity that they're trying to cope with. Now, there's also a literature on organisational resilience. So this is not really my field, but I happen to come across it. This refers to the ability of an organisation to sustain or resume normal functioning in the face of changes or disturbances. Resilient organisations have high reliability to continue operating at a certain level regardless of changes in conditions. This is attributed to an ability to respond to changes or disturbances, to monitor the operating environment, to learn from events, and as far as possible to anticipate future events. So to summarise, these are the characteristics that we see in resilient people that distinguishes them from people who are not so resilient. First, they're optimistic. They see adversity as temporary and that things can improve. Second, they think positively. Adversity is a challenge, not a personal failure. Third, they use active rather than passive coping strategies. Active coping strategies means that people think or act in ways that deal directly with the problem, whereas passive coping strategies are thinking or acting in ways that avoid the problem or get others to cope instead, or doing stuff that helps you feel better, like drinking more or something, rather than tackling the problem. Fourth, they learn from their failures to get better outcomes. And we contrast that with learned helplessness, where people feel defeated by failures rather than learning from them. Fifth, they expect to have their share of setbacks and they prepare for them. And last, of course, as I said before, these skills can be learned by those who do not already have them. So I'd like to finish with a few quotes that I like about this area. The first is from Thomas Edison, credited with inventing the light bulb, or at least the light bulb we're familiar with, and whose company also built the first electricity generating station. And he said, "I have not failed. I have found 10,000 ways that will not work." The second one is from a popular American author, Rochelle Goodrich, who said, "If you manage to avoid all of life's abrasions, you'll never be polished enough to shine." And the last one's from my mum, who said, "What doesn't kill you is character building." And I think that she pinched that from Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you.